What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily. So I've had my Samsung Galaxy A12 for more than a month now, and after feeling overwhelmingly positive in my initial impressions about this phone, my opinion has changed just a bit. And I want to go over my experience with this device so far and sort of explain who I think this phone would be good for. Now, let me just say that I don't have anything negative to bring up about the A12 at all. And in fact, I think it's a stellar budget option from Samsung and a decent upgrade over last year's A11 in a few ways too. But I also think this phone is sort of the cutoff in the A series lineup between that quote-unquote budget offering and a more jack-of-all-trades kind of a device. And in my opinion, it's the limitations on this A12 that will really define and separate those who can still appreciate the phone as it is and those who need more, perhaps from the likes of an A21 or upcoming A22 instead. So I'm going to go ahead and go over what this phone does really well, what those certain limitations are, and everything else you need to know. And hopefully this will help you decide if the new A12 is right for you. Right off the bat, let me just say that yes, I consider the A12 to be a budget smartphone first because of its price. At just under $200, it's not the cheapest thing in the world, but examining the spectrum of smartphone prices right now, it's an affordable option by comparison. And here in the US, the A12 is likely going to launch on prepaid carriers at some point as well that offer even better deals. Actually, places like Amazon have the A12 already listed under the retail price, basically approaching $180 now, so that's great. And if you're interested, I'll leave some links down below in the video description to all the deals and discounts for this device. But while the A12 isn't the cheapest phone in Samsung's lineup, I think it's still a relatively affordable option. And at that price, you get a phone that at a glance looks pretty solid. You can tell it's not a flagship phone, but I don't think there's anything too offensive about the design here. For whatever reason, we get a V-shaped camera notch up top rather than that corner hole punch cutout like last year, but that's not a big deal. Everything else up front looks good too, and even with a bit of a chin, you're getting more than an 85% screen to body ratio. Also, the A12 now comes in at 6.5 inches, just a bit bigger than last year. And overall, I thought one of the major selling points of the A11 last year was the fact that you got such a big device for this price. And that's once again the case here. It's, I think, just at that upper end of comfortability. There's some hand position shifting that's required, but it's not too bad. In the hand though, right away, you can tell this phone is all plastic. And unfortunately, it's not that nicer, shiny, or matte faux glass finish that some other phones rock. What Samsung delivered here is a new fit and finish though that's quite unique to this phone. And honestly, not a bad change, all things considered. It's this sort of lined textured design. It's kind of grippy actually. And there's a little bit of a transition towards the bottom near the Samsung logo. All in all, even though it's as plastic as can be, it's fine. It's just what you'd expect on a phone like this. With the cheaper build, you obviously do sacrifice some things. There's no water resistance rating, no wireless charging. You can decide if either one of those is important to you. But taking a look around, everything else you might want is here. On the international unlocked version of this phone, we get dual SIM and SD card support. There's a headphone jack at the bottom alongside the USB-C charging port, and a new placement and setup for the fingerprint sensor. It's moved from the rear of the phone to the side. It's paired up with that power button. And in my opinion, this is a great setup. It's accurate, it's convenient, and it's fast enough to where I almost never see the lock screen. A great change for sure, and just a nice little addition on a phone like this. Face unlock is also still here too. That's totally fine, at least when you can utilize it, but 99% of the time, it's that updated fingerprint sensor that gets me into the phone the fastest. So I do want to dive into a couple of the things this phone does really well now, and also some of those limitations I talked about earlier. And I think the first thing worth getting excited about with the A12 is its battery life. This phone now packs a fairly large 5,000 milliamp battery inside. It's bigger than last year and definitely at the upper end of the size spectrum just in general. With this capacity, you can easily exceed 12 hours of screen on time under moderate usage. And honestly, if you're not big on social media or gaming, maybe just text messages, phone calls, web browsing, stuff like that, you can absolutely go 2 full days without ever charging this phone. Now, on the one hand, the massive size of this battery is a contributing factor to its longevity, but the other side of the equation is the combination of internal specs that this phone offers. The A12 is powered by the MediaTek Helio P35 chipset, anywhere between 3 and 6 gigs of RAM, and 32, 64, or 128 gigs of internal storage. Kind of a lot of configuration options for a phone like this, actually. I got mine with 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of storage, and these sort of low-end specs are what also helps make this phone last. Now, at the same time, the specs inside this phone are also going to be that limiting factor, depending on what it is you want to do. The A12 is a great device for the casual basic stuff: texting, phone calls, emails, web browsing, GPS, light social media, YouTube videos. It's a fairly responsive phone in most cases with all of that, but I think you can still pick out certain instances where there's a little bit of a blip in scrolling, a delay in loading or launching apps, stuff like that. And this is just where you kind of have to keep your expectations realistic and decide if this sort of experience is okay with you. It's a slower phone, not outright slow, just maybe a fraction of a second more load time than some of us might be used to. Beyond that, if you want to push the phone a little more, if you've got a bunch of stuff running, maybe a YouTube video playing in the background while browsing the web, or you have a bunch of apps open at once, that's still not going to be a big deal, and I haven't run across any app crashes or issues, at least with the usual stuff. When it comes to gaming though, this is sort of where this phone reaches its threshold. For some games, the experience is mostly fine. I think you can pick out plenty of titles that are silky smooth in action and that don't feel so limited by the extended load times. Other games, more graphics heavy ones, maybe ones that don't get as optimized from those big name publishers too, those can be a little choppy at times. You might not be able to play at max settings, you could experience some frame drops. It's not usually unplayable, just maybe a little unpleasant. And I ran into a couple random games like Trucks Off-Road that didn't even load at all, which was kind of weird. I think if you want to pass the time with simple games, the A12 won't have an issue. But if you have a few titles you rotate between, if you play online, if you like the graphics heavy stuff, this phone probably just isn't gonna really work for you. And this, I think, is that cutoff, so to speak, that I mentioned earlier. The performance potential on the A12 is great for people who just need a device, something that's reliable, not over the top, and can handle everyday smartphone stuff. For anything beyond that, you'll need to step up to something like the A21 or upcoming A22 and beyond in order to satisfy your need for gaming, multitasking, and a snappier and more responsive experience. And by the way, yes, the A12 also runs One UI Core, Samsung's sort of watered down version of their Android experience, but I don't really think that's worth fussing over. I don't even know why Samsung has that distinction, since there's only a handful of just random things not on this phone that most people won't even notice. The bigger question mark is just whether or not this phone will get the newest Android and One UI updates. I'm sure it will. It may just be a little bit of time before that happens. In regards to the display, this is an aspect of the A12 that I would have been a little critical of, and I would have considered it another sort of threshold spec that separates it from a more mid-tier device. It's a 720p LCD panel, after all, at 264 pixels per inch, but with Motorola bringing back 720p displays on their $300 phones, and Samsung now launching the A32 with a 720p TFT panel, I'm sort of at a loss here. The A12 is a phone that I guess is allowed to have a display like this given its price and positioning in the lineup. But with $250 and $300 phones now seemingly also having 720p displays, I don't really know what to aim for. What you get here on this phone is perfectly fine for the money. I think it's the big size that you're paying for most. Consuming content on something like this is great. And honestly, for an LCD panel, it's not bad. It's pretty bright, fairly bold and colorful. It's just kind of weird now thinking that you used to be able to spend maybe $50 more or $100 more and get something better. Now, that's not the case for some reason. And that sort of makes this phone an even better value considering how awful of a value some of those other more expensive phones are with basically the same 720p screen now. With the out loud listening experience, the single downward facing speaker on the A12 is fine as it is. It's the same sort of setup all the A series phones have had, though in comparison to some others, it seems to me like volume isn't quite as high. Here's a quick sound sample so you can get an idea. Like I said, nothing terrible about it, and the headphone jack still being there too is a nice little bonus also. Finally, when it comes to the cameras, this is another area where I think the A12 was sort of brought up a notch to match the crazy high expectations we have for smartphone pictures and videos nowadays. But at the same time, there's still a lot of limitations that could be worth considering. First off, with the hardware, you get a 48 megapixel main lens, 5 megapixel ultra wide lens, 2 megapixel macro, and 2 megapixel depth sensor. And actually, this setup is pretty close to what we saw on some of the highest end A series phones last year, so that's encouraging on its own. The downside is that a lot of the shooting modes, features, and extras we've grown accustomed to still haven't made it to this device. There's no night mode, for example, and not much else as far as filters and add-ons. There's no video stabilization at all either, and you're limited to 1080p at 30 frames per second. Also, this is a device that, for whatever reason, the viewfinder shows just an awful snapshot and preview of your potential picture. When you finally capture the shot and look back after processing, the image is just so much better. So don't get discouraged if the initial view on screen is a bad look. The end result is usually pretty good, but there's a couple things to consider. The wide angle and portrait modes tend to get a little dark, while the main lens certainly saturates the scenes, maybe a little more than it should. Fortunately, the main lens still captures a lot of detail, I think, which is great. But if video is your thing, this probably isn't the phone for you. The lack of any sort of stabilization at all makes things feel choppy and jittery. Also, the selfie camera is okay. It's kind of a mixed bag. Standard shots are a little dull. Portrait shots have some trouble defining borders and separating the foreground. I'd much rather just flip the phone around actually and take a picture of myself with a rear lens if I can. It just produces a way nicer looking shot in all aspects. All in all, while it's obvious the A12 offers much more camera potential than the lower end A series phones of the past, it's still tough, I think, when smartphone tech nowadays continues to evolve so quickly. All in all, I consider this new A12 to be a great value device, just as long as you understand what it can and cannot do. It's a big phone with a big screen that's great for watching content. And since a whole bunch of other new phones nowadays seem to have 720p screens for some dumb reason, that makes this phone a strangely good value in that regard. The massive battery is also a huge plus, and most people who use this phone will be able to get 2 days of use out of it without having to juice up. If you aren't into gaming, the specs are more than fine, and for snapping some quick pics, I don't really have any complaints either. But if you're looking for a device worth gaming on, if you're a camera or a video buff who takes pictures daily, you'll certainly want to move up a notch. This probably isn't the phone for you. For anyone else who needs a device that's reliable with the simple stuff, with some added value perks to go along with it, the A12 is absolutely worth it. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on the new Samsung Galaxy A12. What do you guys think about this phone? Is it something you're considering? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.